I'm Michael Carter, and I'm 56 years old now, but everything I am today traces back to one single night. A night so sharp and clear in my memory that it still feels closer than yesterday. I was 16 back then, tall but skinny, shoulders always hunched like I was apologizing for taking up space, still believing in that simple lie kids grow up with, the idea that blood means safety and parents are forever. That night shattered all of it. It was raining hard, not the calm kind of rain, but the angry Midwest kind that lashes sideways and turns the sky into a dark, roaring thing. The clouds were so low it felt like the world was pressing down on our house. I remember my shoes squelching as I stepped inside, my backpack heavy on one shoulder, rainwater dripping down my hair and onto the carpet. I stood there thinking I was about to get yelled at, maybe grounded, maybe lose my phone or my weekend. I had no idea I was about to lose my family. The living room looked the same as it always had, beige walls, old couch, the TV humming in the background like it was pretending nothing serious was happening. My dad stood near the television with his arms crossed tight against his chest, his jaw set, his face calm in a way that should have scared me more than anger. My mom sat on the couch, back straight, hands folded in her lap, lips pressed together so tightly they were almost white. She didn't look surprised to see me soaked and shaking. She looked prepared, like she'd rehearsed this moment. I started talking fast, explaining the suspension, trying to make it sound smaller than it was, telling them I hadn't meant for things to go that far, that it was just one stupid mistake. My voice was cracking, but I was still hopeful. Kids always are. We think if we explain enough, if we say the right words, the people who love us will step in and protect us. I didn't even get to finish my sentence. My father lifted his head slightly and looked straight at me, not with rage, not with disappointment, but with something colder, something final. He said, "If you walk out that door tonight, don't bother coming back, you're dead to us." That was it. No shouting, no dramatic pause, no emotion in his voice. Just a statement like he was reading the weather or announcing a rule that had already been decided. Those words hit me so hard I felt dizzy. I actually laughed for half a second because my brain refused to accept them as real. Dead to us. Parents aren't supposed to say that. Parents aren't supposed to mean it. I looked at my mom, waiting for her to jump in to argue, to tell him he was going too far. I needed her to say something, anything. She didn't. She just nodded once, slow and quiet, like she was agreeing to a business deal. Her eyes didn't soften. They didn't fill with tears. They looked empty, like she'd already moved on. In that moment, something deep inside my chest collapsed. I realized this wasn't a threat. It wasn't a scare tactic. This was a decision they'd already made, and I was the last one to find out. I stood there frozen, rain still dripping off me, my heart beating so loud I could hear it in my ears. I waited. I honestly believed that if I waited long enough, one of them would change their mind. I thought my dad would sigh and wave his hand and tell me to go to my room. I thought my mom would stand up and pull me into a hug. I waited for the words "hold on" or "sit down" or "let's talk." Nothing came. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, pressing into my chest until it hurt to breathe. That silence was worse than screaming. It told me everything I needed to know. My legs moved before my brain caught up. I turned toward the door, every step feeling unreal, like I was watching someone else walk away. Part of me still believed they'd stop me, that I'd hear my name called out, that a hand would grab my arm. I opened the door and the rain and wind rushed in, cold and loud. I stepped outside and waited one last second, standing there in the doorway, half inside, half out, giving them one final chance. The door closed behind me. The lock clicked. That sound, that small metal click, did more damage to me than any punch ever could. It wasn't loud, but it was absolute. It told me there was no coming back. I stood there in the rain for a long moment, staring at the door like it might open again if I stared hard enough. It didn't. The house glowed warm behind the curtains, a place I was no longer welcome. I walked away because I had nowhere else to go. That night stretched on forever. The rain soaked through my clothes, through my shoes, through everything. I walked until my legs burned and my throat felt tight from holding back tears. I ended up under a highway bridge, the concrete cold and damp, cars roaring overhead like the world rushing past me without noticing I was gone. I curled up against my backpack, hugging it to my chest like it was the last proof I existed. I shook from the cold, from fear, from shock. Every few minutes I replayed the moment in my head, convinced I must have misunderstood, that I'd imagined it. But the sound of that lock kept coming back, over and over. Lying there in the dark, listening to the rain hit the concrete, I realized I hadn't just lost a roof over my head. I'd lost my name, my place, my history. I'd lost the people I thought would always be there no matter what. I felt small, disposable, like something that had been thrown away without a second thought. I stared up at the underside of the bridge and asked myself a question I didn't have the words to answer. How does a kid die while still breathing? That night, a version of me did die. No funeral, no goodbye, just a quiet ending that no one but me noticed. The weeks after that night were rougher than I ever admit out loud, even now, because surviving at 16 with no family isn't brave or inspiring or cinematic. It's slow, humiliating and terrifying in ways you don't forget. There was no dramatic plan, no clear direction, just one day bleeding into the next while I figured out how to stay warm, how to eat, and how not to disappear completely. Hunger became a constant background noise, like a low hum in my body that never shut off. I learned what real hunger feels like, not skipping lunch hunger, but the kind that makes your hands shake and your thoughts get fuzzy, the kind that turns food into an obsession and dignity into a luxury you can't afford. At first I crashed on friends' couches, kids I'd grown up with, people who swore they had my back. For a few nights it felt almost normal, like a sleepover that went on too long. But parents notice things. They notice extra showers, extra meals, extra backpacks by the door. They start asking questions, and questions lead to uncomfortable truths, and uncomfortable truths lead to polite smiles and closed doors. I heard a lot of phrases like maybe just for a few nights, or we'll see, or let us talk about it. And then suddenly, I was packing my bag again, saying thanks like I wasn't being quietly pushed out. Each goodbye chipped away at me a little more, not because I blamed them, but because it reminded me how temporary I was in everyone's life. When couches ran out, I learned the geography of the city in a different way. I learned which parks were safer after dark, which benches were close enough to streetlights to feel less invisible, which shelters filled up early and which ones smelled so bad you almost preferred the cold. Shelters were loud, crowded, and unpredictable. You learned to sleep with one eye open, to keep your bag wrapped around your arm, to trust your instincts when someone got too close. Park benches were quieter but colder, and you never really slept, not fully. Your body rests but your mind stays alert, waiting for footsteps, waiting for trouble. Nights were the hardest. During the day you could keep moving, pretend you had somewhere to be. At night, everything slowed down, and that's when the loneliness hit hardest. I took whatever work I could get, no questions asked, no pride involved. I washed dishes until my hands cracked and bled from hot water and cheap soap. I hauled trash behind restaurants, the smell clinging to my clothes no matter how much I scrubbed. I stocked shelves overnight at grocery stores, working while the world slept, moving boxes in silence under buzzing fluorescent lights. Every job paid little, but every paycheck felt like proof that I still mattered somehow. It wasn't about the money alone. It was about standing there at the end of a shift, exhausted and sore, knowing I'd earned my place for one more day. Even when supervisors balked orders or customers ignored me like I was part of the furniture, I kept going. I told myself that work meant survival, and survival meant I hadn't lost yet. School slowly slipped away from me. At first I tried to keep up, showing up tired, wearing the same clothes too many days in a row, pretending everything was fine. But homework doesn't care if you slept under a bridge. Tests don't wait because you worked a double shift. Teachers notice when you're distracted, when you fall behind, when your eyes look older than your age. Eventually, it became obvious that I couldn't do both. Survival won. Dropping out felt like another failure stamped onto my forehead. Another way I didn't measure up, but at the time it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like gravity. You can't argue with gravity when you're falling. Emotionally, those weeks were a mess. Some nights I cried so hard my chest hurt, my face buried in my jacket so no one would hear. I cried for the parents I thought I had, for the kid I used to be, for the life that vanished behind a locked door. Other nights I was so angry I wanted to punch walls, scream into the dark, demand answers from a world that didn't care. And then there were nights when I felt nothing at all. No sadness, no anger, just emptiness. That scared me the most. Feeling nothing made me worry that something inside me was shutting down for good. What hurt more than the hunger or the cold was the silence from my parents. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and there was nothing. No call to check if I was alive. No letter asking where I was. No apology. No explanation. It was like I'd been erased from their lives the moment that door closed. That kind of silence messes with your head in ways I still struggle to explain. You start replaying every memory, every argument, every mistake, trying to figure out what made you so disposable. You wonder if you were ever truly loved, or if you were just tolerated, a responsibility they were relieved to put down. That question crawls into your bones and stays there. I learned quickly that trust was dangerous. People aren't always cruel, but they're not always kind either. Some offered help with strings attached. Some smiled too much, asked too many questions. I learned to keep my mouth shut, to share as little as possible, to read faces and tones like my life depended on it, because sometimes it did. I learned that kindness could disappear just as fast as it appeared, and that depending on it was a gamble I couldn't afford. So I depended on myself. I learned how to stretch a few dollars into meals that lasted days. I learned how to walk with purpose so I didn't look lost. I learned how to disappear into crowds when I needed to and stand my ground when I didn't. Slowly, almost without noticing, that scared, hopeful kid began to change. The softness drained out of me, replaced by something harder, sharper. I stopped begging, stopped explaining myself, stopped expecting rescue. I still wanted connection, still wanted love, but I buried those wants deep because they hurt too much when they went unanswered. I became quieter, more observant, less willing to show weakness. People mistook that for strength, but really it was armor. Armor I built because I had to. There were moments, rare but powerful, when I caught a glimpse of the person I wanted to become. Moments when I finished a long shift and felt proud instead of tired. Moments when I helped someone else in a shelter and realized I still had compassion left in me. Those moments mattered. They reminded me I wasn't just surviving for the sake of it. I was surviving because I believed, somewhere deep down, that this wasn't the end of my story. Every night before I fell asleep, wherever that happened to be, I made the same quiet promise to myself. I promised that this pain wouldn't be the only thing that defined me. I promised that one day I'd build a life so solid, so steady, that no one would ever be able to throw me away again. I didn't know how I'd do it. I didn't know when. All I knew was that if the world was going to treat me like I didn't matter, I'd prove it wrong by staying alive, by pushing forward, by becoming someone impossible to ignore. By the time I reached my early 20s, exhaustion had become my normal state. I didn't remember what it felt like to be fully rested or fully relaxed. My body was always tired, my mind always running, always planning the next move, the next shift, the next way to stay ahead of falling back into nothing. But beneath that exhaustion was something stronger, something that refused to die. Stubbornness. That stubborn streak saved me more times than I can count. It was the same stubbornness that kept me alive at 16. The same fire that whispered, "You don't get to quit yet, no matter how heavy this feels." I knew I couldn't stay stuck forever. Working low-paying jobs just to survive was keeping me alive, but it wasn't giving me a future. I watched people twice my age doing the same work, day after day, worn down, bitter and invisible, and it scared the hell out of me. I didn't judge them, but I didn't want that life to be the end of mine. So I made a decision that felt almost ridiculous at the time. I decided to go back to school, not because it was easy, not because I believed in myself, but because it was the only door I could see that didn't lead straight back into the dark. Getting my GED wasn't some inspiring comeback story. It was nights spent hunched over borrowed books, eyes burning from exhaustion, trying to remember math formulas I hadn't touched in years. It was studying during lunch breaks in storage rooms, scribbling notes on scraps of paper while eating cheap sandwiches. It was failing practice tests and feeling that old voice creep back in, the one that said maybe your parents were right, maybe you really aren't worth much. Every time that voice showed up, I pictured that front door closing behind me, heard that lock click again, and my anger kicked in. I wasn't doing this to prove I was smart. I was doing it to prove I couldn't be erased. When I finally passed the GED, I didn't celebrate. I just sat there quietly, staring at the paper, feeling something close to disbelief. It wasn't pride yet. It was relief. Proof that I could still learn, still move forward, still build something out of the mess. Community college came next, and walking onto that campus for the first time felt strange. I was older than most of the students, rougher around the edges, carrying a past I couldn't explain in casual conversation. I worked full-time while taking classes, sometimes full shifts followed by night lectures where I fought to keep my eyes open. I'd sit in the back, listening, taking notes, reminding myself that every hour I spent there was an hour I wasn't stuck. There were days I wanted to quit so badly it scared me, days when everything went wrong at once. A bad grade, a boss yelling, bills stacking up, no one to call when things fell apart. The weight of doing everything alone pressed down on my chest until it felt hard to breathe. I watched other students complain about their parents not sending money fast enough or being too strict, and I wanted to laugh and scream at the same time. They had no idea how lucky they were. On those days, quitting felt tempting like rest, but quitting also felt like surrender, and surrender meant proving my parents right. That thought kept me moving. After community college, I transferred to a state university. It felt unreal, like I was trespassing in someone else's life. I kept working full-time, sometimes more, juggling schedules that made no sense, living on caffeine and stubbornness. I didn't have a safety net. If I failed, there was no one to catch me. That pressure was terrifying, but it also sharpened me. I learned discipline fast. I learned how to prioritize, how to manage time, how to push through discomfort without complaining. Those lessons followed me long after the classes ended. I went into logistics and operations because it made sense to me. It was structured. It rewarded planning, consistency, and effort. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid. I started at the bottom, like always, learning how warehouses ran, how shipments moved, how small mistakes turned into big problems. I paid attention. I asked questions. I stayed late. I noticed things other people ignored. Slowly, people started noticing me. Promotions came faster than expected. Responsibilities grew. By my late 20s, I wasn't just another worker. I was leading teams, fixing broken systems, making decisions that mattered. Climbing that ladder wasn't smooth. There were setbacks, failures, moments when I doubted myself. But every challenge reminded me how far I'd already come. By my 30s, I was running warehouses, managing budgets, signing contracts, sitting in rooms where my opinion carried weight. Sometimes I'd look around those rooms and feel like an imposter, like someone was going to tap me on the shoulder and tell me I didn't belong. But no one did, because I did belong. I'd earned it the hard way. Around that time, I met the woman who would become my wife. She knew my past, or at least the parts I could talk about, and she didn't flinch. She didn't try to fix me or pity me. She saw me as I was and chose me anyway. That meant more to me than she ever realized. When we had kids, something inside me shifted. Holding them for the first time, I felt a fierce, almost overwhelming sense of responsibility. I promised myself they would never doubt whether their dad loved them. I told them I loved them every day. I showed up. I stayed. I became the parent I never had. We built a home that felt safe. Not fancy, not perfect, but warm. A place where voices were heard, where mistakes didn't lead to exile, where love wasn't conditional. On the surface, my life looked complete. Successful career, family, stability. But there was still a quiet corner of my heart that stayed locked up. I never talked about my parents, not because I'd forgiven them, not because I was still raging, but because I didn't know how to explain being abandoned by the very people who were supposed to protect you. How do you put that into words without sounding broken? Part of me still hoped, stupidly, that one day they'd show up and say they were wrong, that they'd admit they failed me, that they'd acknowledge the damage they caused. Another part of me imagined that moment differently. Imagined looking them in the eye and letting them see the life I built without them. Not to hurt them, not to gloat, but to show them exactly what they threw away when they decided I was disposable. I carried both those feelings quietly, letting them coexist, waiting without realizing that one day, that wait would finally end. 20 years after the night I was thrown out on a quiet Sunday afternoon that felt ordinary in every possible way, my entire world paused because of one simple sound: a knock at the front door. It wasn't loud or urgent, not the kind of knock that usually means trouble or excitement. It was slow, deliberate, almost hesitant, like the person on the other side wasn't sure they had the right to be there. The moment it happened, something shifted inside me. I can't explain it logically, but my chest tightened, and the air in the house felt heavier, like time itself had slowed down. I remember standing up from the couch, annoyed for half a second because I wasn't expecting anyone, then suddenly uneasy for reasons I couldn't yet name. As I walked toward the door, a strange mix of thoughts ran through my head. Maybe it was a neighbor, maybe a delivery, maybe someone lost. But with every step, my heartbeat got louder, my palms started to sweat, and that old familiar tension crept into my shoulders, the same tension I used to carry as a kid when I knew something bad was coming. I hadn't felt that in years. My house was my safe place. Nothing ever surprised me there. And yet, standing in front of that door, I felt 16 again for just a moment, like my body remembered something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I opened the door, and the past stepped into my present without asking permission. They stood there side by side, close enough that their shoulders almost touched but not quite. My parents, older, smaller, fragile in a way I'd never seen them before. My father's shoulders, once broad and rigid, were slumped forward like he was carrying a weight he could no longer hold up. His hair was thin and gray, his face lined deep with years of stress and regret. My mother looked even smaller, her frame delicate, her hair sparse and dull, pulled back like she hadn't had the energy to care how it looked. The woman who once sat on a couch and nodded while her son was erased now stood in front of me with trembling hands and wet eyes. For a long second, none of us spoke. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, and in that silence, 20 years collapsed into a single breath. I saw flashes of memory layered over their faces. My father standing near the TV with his arms crossed. My mother sitting stiff on the couch, lips tight. The sound of the lock clicking. And then I saw the people in front of me as they were now, worn down by life, by time, by choices they couldn't undo. My father was the first to speak. He said my name quietly, and his voice cracked halfway through it like he wasn't sure he was allowed to say it. Hearing my name come from his mouth after all those years sent a strange shock through me. It didn't feel comforting. It felt invasive, like someone using something they forfeited the right to touch. My mother didn't wait for him to say more. She started crying immediately, the kind of crying that's messy and desperate, words tumbling out between sobs. She said they'd made mistakes. She said they were sorry. She said they needed help. She said they had nowhere else to go. As she spoke, something inside me went very still, not numb, not angry, just clear in a way I hadn't felt before. I listened to her words, watched the way my father avoided my eyes, noticed how neither of them asked how I'd been or what my life looked like now. And that's when it hit me, sharp and undeniable. They didn't come back because they missed me. They didn't come back because guilt finally broke through or because love had resurfaced after all these years. They came back because they needed something. That realization landed like a punch to the gut. It knocked the breath out of me in a way I wasn't prepared for, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed something I'd spent decades trying not to believe. Even now, even after everything, I was still a solution to their problem before I was their son. The kid they'd thrown out had grown into a man with stability, and now that stability was standing right in front of them, framed by a door they once slammed shut. I felt a dozen emotions rise at once. Anger sharp and hot, sadness deep and heavy, a strange sense of validation like a quiet voice inside me saying, "You survived. You made it. They see that now." But above all of it, there was control. For the first time in the story, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't pleading. I wasn't waiting to be chosen. I was standing on solid ground, and they were the ones unsure of their footing. I didn't hug them. I didn't tell them it was okay. I didn't slam the door either. Instead, I stepped aside and invited them in. Not because I owed them kindness, not because I was ready to forgive, but because I wanted to hear everything. I wanted to hear every excuse they'd rehearsed, every regret they'd buried, every justification they'd built to live with themselves for 20 years. I wanted the full truth, not the softened version people use to ease their conscience. They walked into my home slowly, carefully, like guests who weren't sure they'd be welcome for long. I watched them take in their surroundings, the clean floors, the framed family photos on the walls, the quiet warmth of a house built on stability. I wondered what they were thinking as they realized the kid they'd written off hadn't ended up broken on the streets. I wondered if any part of them felt shame, or if they were already calculating how this reunion might save them. As I closed the door behind us, the sound echoed softly through the house. Not a lock clicking this time, just a door closing. And in that moment, I knew something important. This wasn't a reunion. This was a reckoning. And whatever happened next, it would finally be on my terms. We sat at my kitchen table like strangers pretending to be family. 3 people connected by blood, but separated by 20 years of silence and choices that couldn't be undone. I poured the coffee out of habit more than hospitality, my hands steady even though my chest felt tight. The smell filled the room, warm and familiar, and for a brief second it felt absurd that something so ordinary was happening in the middle of something so heavy. They sat across from me, shoulders tense, hands wrapped around their cups like they needed something solid to hold on to. No one spoke at first. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded louder than it ever had, marking time like it always had, even when our lives had fallen apart. Eventually, my mother broke the silence. Her voice was soft, worn down, nothing like the sharp tone I remembered from my childhood. She started talking slowly at first, choosing her words carefully, but once she began, it was like a dam cracked open. She told me that after I left, the house didn't feel the same, that the quiet I'd left behind wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. Arguments that used to stay small grew bigger. Resentment settled in. My father blamed her for being too soft. She blamed him for being too hard. And somewhere in the middle of all that blame, they both avoided the truth that neither of them wanted to face. They had gone too far. Money became a problem not long after. Bills piled up. Repairs were ignored. Bad financial decisions were made in a panic instead of a plan. My father talked then, his voice low and tired, admitting that pride kept him from asking for help when things started slipping. He said he'd always believed he could fix everything himself, that admitting failure felt worse than actually failing. That pride, the same pride that put me out on the street, kept him silent as their situation got worse. Health issues followed one after another. My mother talked about hospital visits, medications they could barely afford, nights spent worrying about things they never used to think twice about. My father's strength faded. My mother's energy disappeared. The house I grew up in slowly fell apart around them, just like their marriage. Eventually, they lost it. Foreclosure papers, boxes packed in silence, doors closing again and again, this time on them. As they talked, I noticed something that stuck with me. They spoke a lot about themselves, about their pain, about their struggles, about how hard life had been after I left. They talked about relatives who stopped answering calls, friends who distanced themselves, bridges burned one argument at a time. And then my mother said it almost casually, like it was an obvious conclusion. With nowhere else to turn, they remembered me. The son they declared dead suddenly became an option again. My father finally looked at me then, really looked at me, and said the words he'd probably practiced 100 times. He admitted he'd said those things that night out of anger and pride. He said he never expected me to disappear forever. He thought I'd cool off, come back, apologize, fall back into line. My mother followed that up with her own confession, her eyes dropping to the table as she said she thought I'd come back begging, that I'd realize how hard the world was and return because I had no choice. Hearing that did something strange to me. It didn't make me angry the way it would have years ago. It didn't even shock me. It snapped something into focus. A truth I'd circled around for decades finally landed clean and clear in my mind. They didn't regret what they did. Not really. They regretted that their plan failed. They regretted that I didn't break the way they expected me to. They regretted that I survived without them. I let them keep talking. I nodded when it made sense to nod. I didn't interrupt or correct them or challenge their version of events. I wanted them to hear themselves. I wanted them to say it all out loud, to understand exactly what they were admitting. Eventually, their words slowed down. The confessions ran out. The room grew quiet again, the weight of everything they'd said hanging in the air between us. That's when I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward or clench my fists. I spoke calmly, steadily, the way you do when you're finally done carrying something heavy and you're ready to set it down. I told them my story from the beginning. I told them about that first night under the bridge, about the cold seeping into my bones, about hugging my backpack like it was the only proof I existed. I told them about hunger that never left, about shelters and park benches and learning which streets felt safer after dark. I told them about the jobs no one wants, about working until my hands hurt and my body gave out, about choosing between food and a place to sleep. I told them about dropping out of school, about the shame of it, about watching my life take a path I never planned. I told them about getting my GED at night, studying when I could barely keep my eyes open, pushing myself forward because stopping felt worse than the pain. I told them about college, about working full-time while trying to build a future from scraps. I told them about the loneliness of doing it all without a single call home, without anyone asking if I was okay. I told them about success too, about building a career, a business, a family, about finding a woman who saw me and stayed, about becoming a father and making a promise to my kids that they would never feel the way I did. I told them about pride, real pride, the kind that comes from surviving something that should have broken you. As I talked, I watched their faces change. My mother cried quietly, tears slipping down her cheeks without any attempt to stop them. My father stared at the table, his hands shaking slightly, his jaw tight. I didn't comfort them. I didn't accuse them either. I just kept telling the truth, layer by layer, until there was nothing left to say. When I finished, the room was completely silent. No excuses, no interruptions, no justifications. They didn't know what to say because there was nothing left to defend. The truth had done what anger never could. It had stripped everything bare. And in that silence, for the first time since I was 16, I felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but balance. The story had finally been told in full, and they could no longer pretend they didn't know the cost of what they'd done. There's a misconception about revenge, especially in the movies or in stories people tell each other over beers or in bars. People imagine it as fire and fury, yelling threats, confrontation that leaves someone broken on the floor. That's not real revenge. Real revenge is quiet. Real revenge is patience. Real revenge is surviving, thriving, and letting the consequences of past actions land in full view, without ever having to throw a punch. That's what I realized the moment they sat across from me at my kitchen table, eyes wide, mouths dry, hands trembling. I could feel the old power imbalance. They thought they still held authority because they were my parents, because they had once been the people who could erase my existence with a single sentence. But time had leveled the playing field. I looked at them and I told them plainly, calmly, that I was doing well. I told them I had built a life from nothing, that I had a family that loved me, a business I had nurtured and grown, a home that felt safe and secure, and all the pieces of a life that they had chosen not to be part of. I didn't gloat. I didn't mock. I didn't smile maliciously or hold my success up like a trophy. I simply stated it, facts, nothing more, and I could see it hit them. Their eyes flicked from mine to my home, taking in the furniture, the neat counters, the warmth that filled the room. It was a quiet, undeniable acknowledgement that I had not only survived without them, but I had thrived. I told them I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the way I had been as a kid, not in the way that kept me awake at night wondering if I'd ever be loved. I had let go of that burning resentment because it didn't serve me anymore. But I also made sure they understood that forgiveness doesn't mean erasing the past. You can forgive someone for existing without consequences, but you don't have to allow them back into your life. History is history, and some lines can't be crossed again without acknowledgement and responsibility. I told them that clearly, calmly, without raising my voice. The words weren't venomous, but they carried weight, the kind of weight that only truth can carry. Then I offered something unexpected. I offered help, resources, information. I told them about shelters, community assistance programs they could apply for. I explained that they weren't completely alone in the world if they needed support, but I made it unequivocally clear that they would not, under any circumstances, live under my roof. Not because I hated them, not because I wanted to punish them physically, but because boundaries matter. I had learned the hard way how vital it was to protect yourself, and I would not undo decades of discipline and healing to accommodate someone who once chose to discard me. I wanted them to know that help can coexist with consequences, that love or assistance does not erase accountability. Watching their faces shift through the spectrum of realization was harder than yelling would have been, harder than slamming doors or screaming. At first there was hope. They thought I might soften, that the son they abandoned would welcome them back into the fold with hugs and tears. That hope flickered briefly, then dimmed into understanding, and finally settled into a deep, raw regret. They realized what they had lost, not just in years, but in the trust, in the bond, in the authority they once wielded unquestioned. I could see it in the tightening of my father's jaw, in my mother's quivering hands. That understanding was the quiet, unshakable power of what I had built. I didn't have to scream. I didn't have to hurt. The life I created spoke louder than any words ever could. I wanted them to understand something fundamental, something I had understood for 20 years. When they told a 16-year-old he was dead to them, they killed any right they had to come back into his life on their terms. They had erased themselves. They had forfeited the position of parent because they treated me as disposable. And now, decades later, they were finally seeing the natural consequence of their choices. This was my revenge, not petty, not vindictive, but complete, undeniable, and morally sound. It wasn't about watching them suffer. It was about making them fully see the cost of their actions, the magnitude of what they had lost, and the unshakable fact that some doors once closed can never be opened again without accountability. I stayed calm the entire time, letting silence hang between us whenever words failed. Every pause, every gulp, every glance at my life around them was a reminder of the quiet justice of survival. Revenge isn't always about breaking someone. Sometimes, it's about showing them that you can thrive without them, that you can build a world they'll never be allowed into again, and that the power they once held over you is gone. I had mastered that form of revenge, the one that doesn't need cruelty, because the hardest part of living through abandonment is learning that your life itself is the greatest comeback story anyone could ever witness. And in that kitchen, watching them struggle to comprehend the life I had created, I realized something even more important. Revenge without cruelty is the kind that lasts, the kind that leaves no trace of hatred, only a quiet, undeniable truth. They had their chance, I had mine, and the difference between us was now crystal clear. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint smell of rain from earlier that afternoon, the kind of smell that sticks to concrete and reminds you that time moves whether you're ready for it or not. They left my house that day quieter than they had arrived. My mother hugged me, a brief, shaky embrace that seemed to carry all the weight of her regret, fear, and exhaustion. Her arms trembled against mine, and I felt the vulnerability of someone who had been pretending to be strong for decades. My father didn't hug me. He stood there for a moment, hands stuffed into his pockets, eyes avoiding mine, and then he nodded stiffly, like he wanted to say more but didn't know where to start. I didn't press him. Words weren't necessary. That gesture alone said enough about the man he had become, the man who had lost the authority to dictate how I existed, and the boy who once trembled under his gaze had grown into someone unshakable. I watched them walk down my driveway step by step, fading into the distance as the light shifted and the evening shadows stretched across the lawn. And for the first time in my life, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in decades. Not relief, not happiness, not even satisfaction, just freedom. Freedom from the weight of the past, from the anticipation of being erased again, from the invisible leash that had held me tethered to a house I had been kicked out of, to parents who had once decided I was expendable. It was a quiet kind of freedom, subtle, almost imperceptible, but it filled my chest in a way that no celebration or recognition ever could. As I closed the door behind me, the sound echoed in the empty hall, and the silence that followed felt different this time. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of abandonment. It was a calm, steady, reassuring silence, the kind that whispers you survived. You lived. You are here. And in that moment, I understood something vital about closure. Closure doesn't always come with forgiveness or reunions or the neat endings people see in movies or read about in books. Closure isn't about hugs, tears, or reconciliation. Sometimes, closure is quieter, stranger, and deeper. It's knowing you survived the worst, grew despite it, and didn't let bitterness or cruelty take root in your heart, even when the world tried its hardest to crush you. I went back inside and walked through my home, the space I had built with my own hands and effort. Every photograph on the wall, every piece of furniture, every laugh echoing from the rooms carried a story of resilience. I found my kids playing in the living room, absorbed in a game, their laughter light and unguarded. Kneeling down, I hugged them tightly, holding them for longer than I usually did, feeling their warmth, their trust, their complete and unquestioned love. In that moment, I silently thanked whatever force in the universe had carried me through those brutal teenage years, through the nights of hunger, fear, and cold, through the years of uncertainty, loneliness, and self-doubt. I thought about the boy I had been, that 16-year-old who had once believed blood meant loyalty, who had been told he was dead, who had walked out into the rain carrying nothing but a backpack and hope he didn't even know he had. I thought about how far I had come since then, the life I had built, the lessons I had learned, and the unshakable sense of self I had forged in the fires of hardship. That boy had survived. That boy had thrived. And that realization, that quiet acknowledgement of my own journey, was more powerful than any confrontation, any revenge, any reconciliation could ever have been. Sitting back on the couch, listening to the distant sounds of traffic and the softer sounds of my children's voices, I allowed myself to feel the calm I had earned. Not joy that erased the past, but a deep, steady peace that comes from knowing you are unbreakable. I understood that closure is an internal state, a recognition that the story doesn't end with someone else's choices or regrets. Closure is about reclaiming the narrative, about holding the pen in your own hand after years of being told what the story was, and deciding that you are the author now. I realized that freedom and closure aren't loud. They don't announce themselves with fanfare. They arrive quietly, in the space between breaths, in the steadiness of your heartbeat, in the clarity of knowing that your life, however scarred, however battered, is yours and yours alone. And as I watched the evening settle outside my windows and felt the comfort of my family around me, I understood that I had finally arrived at a place that no one could take from me. Not my parents, not the past, not the weight of years spent surviving. I had arrived at life itself, and it was mine to live fully, without apology, without bitterness, and without fear. If there's one thing I've carried with me all these years, etched deep into the lines of my face and the quiet moments of my mind, it's this. Family is not just a word on paper, a certificate, or a name shared at the dinner table. Family is defined by actions, by care, by presence, by consistency. It's what you do for each other when the world gets hard, when life throws punches, when survival isn't guaranteed. I was told I was dead at 16, and for a long time I believed that words could break you entirely, that the absence of someone who should have protected you was permanent, unchangeable. But I also learned, painfully and slowly, that actions, and the life you choose to live, carry a weight far heavier than any empty word. Words have power. I feel it even now, decades later, thinking about that night when my parents looked at me and said I didn't exist in their eyes. They didn't scream. They didn't shout. They didn't storm around. They simply spoke a sentence that reshaped my entire life, and in that silence I understood that some words once spoken are impossible to take back. They linger, they echo, they shape decisions long after the moment has passed. I learned that a single phrase could define your identity in ways you don't even realize until years later. But I also learned that those words only have power if you let them. I spent years learning not to let them define me, not to let them decide my worth, not to let them write my story for me. Some doors I discovered once closed can never open the same way again. My parents came back into my life eventually, and I could see them, hear them, touch them even, but the dynamic had shifted irreversibly. I had grown into someone strong, someone capable, someone whole in ways they had never imagined. I had built a life that was solid, grounded, and beautiful, and no apology, no plea, no confession could ever change the fact that I had lived 20 years without their presence and had survived. The door they slammed behind them didn't just close physically, it changed the rules of engagement forever. And that was a lesson I had to learn the hard way, painfully, irreversibly, and on my own. I don't hate my parents, I don't need to. Hate is a heavy, corrosive thing that slowly eats you from the inside. I realized that carrying resentment for decades would have made me a prisoner to the past, and I refused to remain in that cell. I outgrew the pain they caused me, but I didn't forget it. I acknowledged it, honored it, and used it as fuel to become stronger, wiser, and more resilient. Every struggle, every night of fear and hunger, every moment of self-doubt became a tool I wielded not to harm others, but to craft a life that could withstand anything. In reclaiming my power, I discovered freedom, the freedom to live fully, unapologetically, and without anyone else's permission. If you're listening to this, if you've ever felt the sharp sting of abandonment, the crushing weight of rejection, or the quiet pain of being told you didn't matter, hear me clearly. Your value is not dictated by the people who failed to recognize it. You do not need their permission to thrive. You do not need their acknowledgement to create something beautiful, lasting, and meaningful. Your life is yours. Your future is yours. And the choices you make now, the love you give yourself, the boundaries you hold, define your family more than any bloodline ever could. Sometimes the greatest justice isn't confrontation. It isn't revenge, at least not the kind that leaves scars or bruises. The greatest justice is living well. It is building a life so solid, so full of love, stability, and purpose, that the people who discarded you can see it, but they cannot touch it. It's standing tall, knowing that the years they tried to take from you have been reclaimed, restored, and multiplied. It's proving, to yourself first and the world second, that survival was only the beginning and thriving is the triumph. And perhaps the most important lesson of all is this: the person who once broke you cannot dictate who you become. Pain can shape you, but it doesn't have to define you. Anger can fuel you, but it doesn't have to consume you. Rejection can wound you, but it doesn't have to destroy you. You are stronger than the worst things that have ever been said to you, than the worst things that have ever been done to you, and you have the power to build a life that even the absence of love cannot diminish. I learned all of this too young, in a storm-soaked living room and on rain-slick streets where I slept under bridges and wondered if anyone would ever care if I lived or died. I carried it into adulthood, into my work, into my relationships, into the quiet moments with my children, into the laughter that finally felt safe. And now, looking back, I can see that every hardship, every betrayal, every moment of fear was a teacher. It taught me resilience, patience, wisdom, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. So if you are out there lost, abandoned, or told you didn't belong, remember this. You do belong to yourself, to the life you are building, to the love you choose to give and receive. You do not owe anyone your approval, your forgiveness, or your time. Stand tall, live well, protect your heart, honor your journey, and know that the life you create, despite every obstacle, is the truest victory of all. Because in the end, thriving after abandonment, choosing love instead of bitterness, and building a life that cannot be erased, that is not just survival. That is the ultimate form of justice, and the most powerful lesson I learned too young.